village of Little Wickham wore its autumn colours like a carefully chosen ensemble, each golden leaf and crimson berry placed with the precision that only nature and centuries of English gardening could achieve. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her sensible walking shoes on the cobblestone path leading to the village green, where the annual Apple Harvest Festival was already in full swing despite the early morning hour. She had arrived 3 days ago to visit her great-niece Clarissa, the new schoolmistress, but found herself genuinely charmed by this particular corner of the Cotswolds. Little Wickham possessed that peculiar quality of appearing utterly peaceful while harbouring the same complex web of human relationships she had observed in St. Mary Mead and countless other villages throughout her long life. The festival preparations buzzed with the kind of organised chaos that spoke of decades of tradition. Mrs. Penelope Ashworth, self-appointed coordinator of all village social events, stood near the ancient oak tree with her clipboard, directing the placement of trestle tables with military precision. Her voice, cultured but carrying steel beneath its pleasant surface, could be heard above the general hubbub. "Mr. Hartwell, the jam competition table needs to be precisely 12 feet from the Morris dancing area," she called to a ruddy-faced man struggling with bunting. "We simply cannot have the dancers knocking over Mrs. Fielding's prize preserves." Miss Marple settled herself on a wooden bench that offered an excellent view of the proceedings, her knitting bag at her side. She had learned long ago that the best way to understand any community was to observe it during moments of celebration, when usual social masks slipped just enough to reveal the dynamics beneath. Near the prize apple tree, a magnificent specimen that dominated the green's northern edge, she noticed a heated discussion in progress. The central figure was Harold Pritchard, a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s, who had purchased Wickham Manor 6 months ago. His arrival had apparently caused considerable stir in the village's carefully established hierarchy. Pritchard gestured emphatically toward the festival preparations, his voice carrying fragments to Miss Marple's trained ear. Completely inappropriate. Proper procedures. Historical significance. The group around him included Mrs. Ashworth, a thin, nervous man she recognized as Timothy Graves, the village historian, and Doctor. Sarah Whitmore, who had returned to Little Wickham 3 years ago under circumstances still whispered about in tea shops. As Miss Marple watched Doctor, Whitmore said something that caused Pritchard's face to darken considerably. He stepped closer, his posture becoming aggressive, while Mrs. Ashworth placed a restraining hand on his arm, speaking in soothing tones. Mr. Graves looked as though he wished himself anywhere else in the world. Quite the drama unfolding came a cheerful voice beside her. A plump elderly woman settled on the bench with a satisfied sigh. "I'm Dorothy Fielding, dear. You must be Miss Marple, Clarissa's great-aunt." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "How kind." There seems to be some disagreement about the festival arrangements. Mrs. Fielding snorted delicately. "Oh, that's nothing to do with the festival. That's about the Hartwell property dispute. Been simmering for months, ever since Mr. Pritchard arrived and decided he knew better than everyone else how things should be done. The disagreement near the oak tree reached some resolution, with Doctor Whitmore walking away with quick, angry strides while Pritchard stood watching, hands clenched. Mrs. Ashworth continued speaking urgently until he collected himself and stalked toward the church. "Such strong feelings over property matters," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers working automatically with her knitting wool. "The Hartwell family has owned that orchard for over a century," Mrs. Fielding explained, "but young James got into financial difficulties. Gambling debts, they say, and had to sell a portion to keep the rest. Mr. Pritchard bought it up and now claims the Hartwells have been encroaching on his land, using his property to access their orchard." As if summoned by their conversation, James Hartwell himself appeared, moving with purposeful stride. He was younger than Miss Marple expected, perhaps 35, with weathered hands and sun-darkened skin that spoke of outdoor work. His wife Eleanor walked beside him, pretty but worried, while their teenage son David trailed behind, arguing with his parents in intense whispers. The family reached the green's edge and paused, James scanning the crowd. His gaze settled on Pritchard, who had returned and was now supervising the apple-bobbing preparations. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the bustling festival, and Miss Marple felt that familiar prickle of unease, the sense that she was witnessing something significant. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm, speaking quietly, and the moment passed. James allowed himself to be guided toward their family's apple stall. But Miss Marple noticed young David continued staring in Pritchard's direction, his young face set in lines too hard for someone his age. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple found herself drawn into the gentle rhythm of rural celebration. She admired displays of heritage apples with names like Ashmead's Kernel and Pitmaston Pineapple, sampled Mrs. Ashworth's prize-winning chutney, and even attempted the apple-peeling contest, though her arthritic fingers proved no match for practiced farm wives. Throughout it all, she remained aware of tensions flowing beneath the festival's cheerful surface. Pritchard moved through the crowd with the bearing of command, but conversations faltered when he approached, groups finding sudden reasons to move elsewhere. He appeared oblivious to the subtle snubs, but Miss Marple could see isolation in his shoulders and the way his eyes lingered wistfully on laughing neighbours. Dr. Whitmore moved with professional purpose, stopping to chat with patients and families, her manner softening with village children, yet she carefully avoided areas where Pritchard stood. Near the Hartwell stall, Eleanor did brisk business selling harvest apples and homemade butter, while James worked with quiet efficiency, periodically scanning the crowd as if expecting trouble. Young David helped reluctantly, glancing longingly at teenagers gathered around the Morris dancers. Miss Marple noticed something odd. Pritchard stood near the jam competition, apparently discussing church architecture with Mr. Graves, but his attention focused elsewhere, specifically on the Hartwell family and their interactions. There was something in his expression that went beyond ordinary interest in business rivals. It was more personal, more knowing, as if he were watching a familiar play unfold. The afternoon drew toward the prize ceremony when the first signs of real trouble began. Raised voices came from the old orchard bordering the green, where property lines between Hartwell land and Pritchard's purchase were disputed. A crowd gathered, and even from distance Miss Marple could hear an argument in progress. "I think," she murmured, gathering her knitting and rising unhurriedly, "it might be time for a walk among the apple trees." As she made her way toward the orchard, she could see the crowd growing and voices becoming heated. Whatever was happening was clearly more serious than festival disagreements. The peaceful afternoon was about to take a decidedly darker turn, and Miss Marple found herself perfectly positioned to observe whatever drama was about to unfold beneath the ancient apple trees. The Apple Harvest Festival of Little Wickham was about to become memorable for reasons no one could have anticipated. Miss Marple approached the orchard with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned that the most important revelations often came to those who simply watched and waited. The raised voices drew her toward the ancient stone boundary wall, where a crowd had gathered beneath the spreading branches of heritage apple trees. Harold Pritchard stood with his back to the prize apple tree, a surveyor's map clutched in his hands like a weapon. His face was flushed with righteous indignation as he faced James Hartwell, whose own complexion had darkened to match the autumn leaves above them. "This is absolutely final, Hartwell," Pritchard declared, his cultured voice carrying clearly across the orchard. "I've had my surveyor confirm the boundaries this very morning. Your family has been trespassing on my property for months, using my land as a thoroughfare to reach your trees." James Hartwell's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That pathway has been used by Hartwells for 4 generations. The spring beyond those trees has watered our livestock since before your grandfather was born, Pritchard." "Sentiment doesn't override legal ownership," Pritchard replied coldly. "The deed is registered. The boundaries are marked." "I'm having new fencing installed Monday morning." Eleanor Hartwell placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm, while young David stood rigid beside them, his face a mask of helpless fury. Several villagers had gathered in an uncomfortable semicircle, their expressions ranging from sympathy for the Hartwells to barely concealed hostility toward the newcomer. Dr. Whitmore appeared at the edge of the crowd, her medical bag suggesting she'd been interrupted during house calls. Miss Marple noticed how the doctor's eyes moved between the arguing men with professional assessment, as though evaluating potential for violence. Mrs. Ashworth hurried through the gate, slightly breathless. "Gentlemen, please! This is hardly appropriate during our festival. The prize ceremony begins in 15 minutes, and the vicar is waiting." "The vicar can wait," Pritchard interrupted. "This matter requires immediate resolution." Young David suddenly broke free from his mother's grasp. "You don't belong here," he burst out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Nobody wants you here." The words hung in the afternoon air like an accusation. Pritchard's face darkened, and for a moment Miss Marple glimpsed something beneath his controlled exterior, genuine anger, or perhaps wounded pride. Mrs. Ashworth stepped between them with practiced diplomacy. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion after the festival." The ceremony really must begin on schedule. The crowd began dispersing reluctantly, but Miss Marple lingered near a particularly fine Cox's orange pippin, ostensibly admiring the fruit while observing the participants. She noticed that doctor. Whitmore remained as well, apparently checking something in her medical bag while keeping one eye on Pritchard. 20 minutes later, the festival crowd had reassembled beneath the colourful bunting near the ancient oak. Pritchard took his position with the judging committee, his earlier confrontation apparently forgotten, as he examined entries with professional thoroughness. The vicar began with a rambling speech about community spirit, before introducing Pritchard to announce the winners. Miss Marple found herself standing near Eleanor Hartwell, noting the woman's barely concealed tension. James remained at their stall, ostensibly packing fruit but clearly watching the ceremony with suspicious eyes. Pritchard stepped forward to address the crowd, but as he began to speak, something extraordinary happened. His confident smile faltered, replaced by confusion. His face went pale, then flushed an alarming red. He gripped the edge of the judging table, swaying slightly. "Harold?" Dr. Whitmore moved toward him immediately, medical training overriding personal feelings, but Pritchard waved her, away with a gesture that seemed more instinctive than considered. "Perfectly fine," he managed, though his voice sounded strained. "Just a moment of—" He never finished the sentence. His words became slurred and confused, his movements unsteady. The crowd stirred uneasily as he stumbled, reaching blindly for support. Dr. Whitmore rushed forward, but before she could reach him, Harold Pritchard collapsed beneath the very apple tree where he had stood triumphant during the morning's preparations. The festival crowd surged forward in shock and curiosity, but Dr. Whitmore took charge with professional authority. "Please step back. Give him air." She knelt beside the fallen man, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she checked pulse and breathing. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe everything while appearing to be simply another concerned festival-goer. She watched Dr. Whitmore's face carefully, noting the progression from professional concern to growing alarm, and finally to the grim certainty that spoke of irreversible loss. "Someone call an ambulance," the doctor said quietly, but even as she spoke, her expression indicated it was already too late. Harold Pritchard lay still beneath the ancient apple tree, his face peaceful despite the dramatic manner of his collapse. As the crowd buzzed with shocked whispers, Miss Marple's experienced eye caught details others missed. The way Pritchard had clutched his collar before falling, the faint scent of lavender that seemed oddly out of place among the orchard's natural fragrances, and most intriguingly, the neat precision of the purple ribbon that circled the tree trunk, tied with the kind of careful knot that spoke of particular habits rather than festival haste. Near the tree's roots, she noticed a paper cup lying on its side, apparently dropped during Pritchard's collapse. The grass around it remained remarkably dry despite the cup's contents having spilled, suggesting it had been empty, or nearly so, when it fell. As Dr. Whitmore completed her examination and the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Miss Marple quietly observed the faces around her. The apple harvest festival was over, but her real work was just beginning. In her long experience, when a controversial man died suddenly during a public gathering, natural causes were often the least natural explanation of all. The ambulance departed with quiet efficiency, leaving behind a festival ground that felt suddenly hollow despite the colourful bunting still fluttering overhead. The crowd fragmented into small clusters, each processing Harold Pritchard's shocking collapse in their own way. Miss Marple observed how quickly shock transformed into something more complex, a mixture of genuine concern and barely concealed relief. Within an hour, the village's informal information networks had activated with remarkable speed. At Mrs. Fielding's tea shop, the bell above the door chimed constantly as neighbours sought both refreshment and explanation for what they had witnessed. "Heart attack, surely," declared Mrs. Ashworth, settling into her customary role as community authority. The poor man was under tremendous stress with all these property disputes. You could see he wasn't well. Such a colour to his face. "Divine justice, more like," muttered Mrs. Larkin from behind her perpetual mourning veil. "There's still justice in this world, even if it's not always immediate." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully, noting how quickly the village was constructing comfortable explanations. "I noticed he took something from his pocket just before speaking," she offered gently. "A lozenge, perhaps?" Lydia Brown, the former schoolteacher, flushed at her own boldness but nodded. "Yes, I saw that too." Something small to his mouth. There was a scent afterward, lavender, quite strong. This detail sparked immediate interest. Mrs. Fielding leaned forward conspiratorially. "He always carried those lavender lozenges. Said they helped with his throat, though I suspect it was more about appearing refined." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Whitmore's arrival. She requested tea for old Mr. Pemberley, her professional composure firmly in place despite the day's events. When pressed for medical details, she replied carefully, "There are features consistent with cardiac arrest. The coroner will make the final determination." Miss Marple noticed the slight hesitation before features consistent, the careful language of someone avoiding premature conclusions. At the post office, Mrs. Graves presided over mail sorting and information exchange with equal efficiency. Terrible business, she confided to her steady stream of customers, though the man had been receiving some very unpleasant correspondence lately. Legal documents mostly, but also personal letters that seemed to upset him considerably. This caught Miss Marple's attention. Family concerns, perhaps. One letter yesterday from London particularly disturbed him. Crushed it right up, then smoothed it out again with shaking hands. Whatever it contained, it wasn't welcome news. The arrival of James Hartwell created a momentary hush. He collected his mail with careful neutrality, acknowledging condolences with appropriate gravity. "Whatever our differences, I wouldn't wish such an end on anyone," he said, though Miss Marple noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he sorted through letters. At the plough and sheaf the atmosphere was more openly bitter. Tom Davy, recently dismissed from Wickham Manor, held court at the bar with undisguised satisfaction. "Man comes here thinking he owns everything and everyone," he declared. "Maybe the Lord decided little Wickham had suffered enough." "That's harsh, Tom," replied the landlord, polishing glasses with nervous energy. "Dead men can still trouble the living." "Not as much as living men troubled us," George Larkins muttered into his pint. "There's a mortgage that doesn't care if a man's heart stops." Miss Marple absorbed these various perspectives while walking the village paths in the fading afternoon light. The community was already settling into its preferred narrative, natural causes removing an unwelcome presence without moral complication. Yet several details troubled her methodical mind. The purple ribbon around the apple tree, tied with the precise knot of someone skilled in such work. The paper cup found near Pritchard's body apparently empty despite his obvious distress. The concentrated scent of lavender that seemed oddly localized. Most telling was the speed with which everyone accepted simple explanations despite Dr. Whitmore's careful professional hedging. As evening approached, word spread that Inspector Craddock would arrive from the county constabulary. This news prompted another round of speculation, though most villagers seemed confident the investigation would confirm their preferred theory of natural causes. Returning to Clarissa's cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the day's observations. Little Wickham wanted desperately to believe Harold Pritchard had simply succumbed to stress and natural causes, freeing them from a troublesome presence without uncomfortable questions about motives or guilt. But in her long experience, murder was rarely so accommodating to community preferences. Someone among Pritchard's many enemies had possessed both means and determination to ensure he would never again threaten their way of life. The villagers' eager acceptance of convenient explanations only confirmed her growing suspicion that the truth lay buried beneath layers of self-deception and wishful thinking. The question was not whether Harold Pritchard had been murdered, but which of his numerous enemies had been clever enough to make it appear natural while surrounded by witnesses at a village festival. Inspector Craddock arrived with the morning mist, his unmarked car pulling quietly onto the village green as most residents contemplated their breakfast routines. Miss Marple, observing from Clarissa's kitchen window while preparing her second cup of tea, noted his methodical approach to parking, positioned to observe both the crime scene and the main village pathways. She had worked with the inspector on previous occasions and recognised his particular blend of patience and scepticism. Dr. Hammond, the county pathologist, followed in a separate vehicle, his presence immediately elevating the investigation beyond routine inquiry. The two men conferred briefly before approaching the cordoned apple tree, their professional demeanour a stark contrast to yesterday's festive atmosphere. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had positioned herself on her familiar bench, knitting bag providing perfect camouflage for observation. Inspector Craddock moved through the scene with practised efficiency, photographing angles the festival crowd had ignored. His attention focused on details others had dismissed: the paper cup's precise position, the purple ribbon's distinctive knot, and most tellingly, the disturbed earth near the tree's base. Dr. Hammond's preliminary examination proved more revealing than the village hoped. Miss Marple watched him crouch beside the marked area where Pritchard had fallen, noting his increasingly serious expression as he collected samples and made careful notations. Dr. Whitmore, Inspector Craddock called, summoning the village physician. Their conversation, conducted within Miss Marple's hearing, confirmed her growing suspicions. "The preliminary examination suggests cardiac arrest, Doctor," Whitmore explained carefully, "but there are inconsistencies requiring investigation. The victim's pupils were unusually dilated, and I detected an unusual odour beneath the lavender everyone mentioned." "What sort of odour?" Craddock inquired. "Something chemical, sweet, but with an underlying bitterness, not typical of natural cardiac episodes." Inspector Craddock nodded grimly. "Dr. Hammond will conduct a full post-mortem. Until then, we're treating this as unexplained death requiring thorough investigation." This pronouncement sent visible ripples through the gathering crowd. Mrs. Ashworth approached with characteristic determination to maintain social order. "Surely, Inspector, this is merely formality." Poor Mr. Pritchard was obviously under tremendous stress. "We follow proper procedures, madam," Craddock replied diplomatically. "I'll need statements from everyone who had contact with the deceased yesterday." Miss Marple observed various reactions to this announcement. James Hartwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor twisted her apron strings nervously. Young David suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere, disappearing with the peculiar speed available only to teenagers avoiding adult scrutiny. The inspector established his interview station in the village hall, beginning systematically with Mrs. Ashworth as festival coordinator. Miss Marple positioned herself nearby, her knitting providing excellent cover for eavesdropping through the open window. "He seemed agitated about property disputes," Mrs. Ashworth testified, but that was hardly unusual. "He'd been feuding with various families for months. I did see him take something from his pocket just before speaking, one of those lavender lozenges he always carried." Tom Davy proved less diplomatic when summoned. "Man was a tyrant," his voice carried clearly. "Accused me of stealing when tools went missing. Never mind, they might have been misplaced. But I was working the refreshment table when he collapsed, same as everyone else." During the lunch break, Miss Marple took advantage of the temporary lull to examine the orchard more carefully. The festival debris had been cleared, leaving only official markers where evidence was collected. She walked slowly around the apple tree, her experienced eye noting details others had missed. The disturbed earth Inspector Craddock had photographed showed signs of recent activity, though not necessarily connected to yesterday's events. More intriguingly, she discovered a small fragment of blue thread caught on a low branch, too high for someone falling, but perfectly positioned for someone reaching upward deliberately. Near the stone boundary wall, she found subtle indentations in soft earth, suggesting someone had waited there for extended periods, possibly observing festival preparations. The position offered excellent views of the apple tree while remaining concealed from casual observation. As she examined these details, footsteps approached. Inspector Craddock emerged from the village hall, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "I should have expected to find you taking interest." "What observations have you made?" She smiled gently. "I find it curious how quickly everyone accepted natural causes, Inspector. In my experience, when controversial men die suddenly in public, explanations are rarely as simple as they appear." "Dr. Hammond's findings support your skepticism," Craddock replied quietly. "Evidence suggests Mr." Pritchard ingested something that triggered his collapse. The question is whether it was accidental, self-administered, or deliberate poisoning. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised by this confirmation. The village has many theories about who might have wished him harm, but they focus on rather obvious suspects. The real murderer, I suspect, has been hiding in plain sight. Dr. Hammond approached across the green, his expression grave. Inspector, I've completed the preliminary examination. While I cannot confirm anything definitively without laboratory analysis, there are strong indicators suggesting this was not natural death. The chemical residue, muscle rigidity patterns, and other factors point toward deliberate poisoning. The official pronouncement hung in the afternoon air like an accusation. Little Wickham's comfortable narrative of divine justice had crumbled, replaced by the uncomfortable reality that someone among them was a murderer. The Apple Harvest Festival's tragic conclusion was now officially a murder investigation, and the village's carefully maintained facade was about to face its most serious test. The confirmation of murder sent ripples of unease through Little Wickham, transforming whispered speculation into urgent need for resolution. By morning, the village had crystallized around its preferred solution. Tom Davy, the dismissed groundskeeper whose bitter grievances against Harold Pritchard were known to everyone. Inspector Craddock found himself receiving an impromptu delegation at the village hall. Mrs. Ashworth led the group with characteristic authority, her expression mixing civic duty with barely concealed eagerness for closure. Inspector, we feel obligated to share our concerns about Tom Davy, she announced. His behaviour yesterday was quite disturbing, and his history with poor Mr. Pritchard suggests obvious motives. Mrs. Fielding nodded vigorously. He made terrible threats at the pub just last week, said Mr. Pritchard would regret dismissing him. George Larkin heard him say it. The mentioned Mr. Larkin shuffled forward reluctantly. Well, yes, he was rather heated about losing his position. But Tom drinks heavily since his dismissal, Inspector. Men say things when they're in their cups that they don't necessarily mean. Miss Marple observed this impromptu tribunal from her corner seat, noting how quickly the community united around their preferred solution. The desire to identify Tom Davy as the murderer transcended normal village divisions, creating temporary alliances between people who ordinarily avoided each other. Inspector Craddock listened patiently before responding. I appreciate your concerns, but investigations require evidence beyond community sentiment. I'll interview Mr. Davy thoroughly, naturally. Tom Davy's interrogation took place that afternoon, with half the village finding reasons to linger near the hall. Through the open window, Miss Marple heard the methodical questioning unfold. Mr. Davy, please describe your activities during yesterday's festival, Craddock began. Work the refreshment table from noon until it happened, Davy replied defensively. Mrs. Ashworth can confirm that. Served punch, helped with apple bobbing, refilled the judges' cups just before the ceremony. You had previous difficulties with Mr. Pritchard? A bitter laugh escaped. Difficulties? Man accused me of stealing tools, dismissed me without references after 15 years, said I was drinking on the job, which was a lie. Did you threaten him? A pause. I may have said things in anger. But saying and doing are different matters, Inspector. The case against Tom seemed to build itself through community expectation. Mrs. Graves reported seeing him fiddling with that purple ribbon near the apple tree, looking agitated. Others recalled his access to refreshments and his presence near the judge's area. More damaging evidence emerged when constables searched his lodgings. They discovered a bottle of rat poison, purchased the previous Tuesday from Keeble's Ironmongers, with Tom's name clearly recorded in the sales book. We've rats in the shed at my lodging, Tom protested when confronted. If you want to hang a man for buying rat poison, Inspector, you can hang half the village. Yet his alibi for the crucial moment remained solid. Multiple witnesses confirmed his presence at the refreshment table throughout the relevant period, serving Mrs. Ashworth cider when Pritchard collapsed. During a brief recess, Miss Marple approached Inspector Craddock with gentle inquiry. I find it curious how quickly everyone accepted Tom as the culprit. In my experience, when communities unite so readily around a suspect, they're often protecting someone else. My thoughts exactly, Craddock replied quietly. The evidence is circumstantial at best. His public threats and obvious motive make him convenient, but poison requires planning and proximity that his alibi doesn't support. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I've been examining that purple ribbon more carefully. It's tied with remarkable precision, a perfect bow with ends cut to match. Not the work of someone fiddling with annoyance, but rather someone with particular habits about neatness and presentation." She produced a small evidence envelope from her knitting bag. "I also found this blue thread caught on a low branch. Fine wool, the sort used for delicate work. It's positioned too high for someone falling, but perfect for someone reaching upward deliberately." Craddock examined the thread with interest. "You think our murderer is someone with access to Pritchard's personal effects and the skill to make poison look like natural causes?" "Precisely. Someone who understands habits and interiors, as I might put it. Tom Davy is a man of direct action and honest anger. Poison is a method requiring patience, planning, and intimate knowledge of the victim's routines. By evening, Tom Davy was released pending further investigation. His alibi held firm, though he remained under suspicion. The village watched his departure with mixed disappointment and unease. Their preferred solution had proved inadequate. Miss Marple returned to the orchard as shadows lengthened. The purple ribbon still circled the trunk, its neat bow undisturbed by the day's drama. She touched the bark lightly, feeling beneath the smoothness a snag where something had caught. Wool, not coarse fabric. The obvious culprit had been tested and found wanting. Yet the community's eagerness to blame Tom Davy only confirmed her growing conviction that the real murderer remained safely hidden among the accusers, watching with satisfaction as suspicion focused elsewhere. In her long experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in pointing fingers at others. The morning light filtered through the apple tree's remaining leaves with the clarity that comes after rain, illuminating details that yesterday's drama had obscured. Miss Marple returned to the scene with the patient determination of someone who understood that murder, like needlework, revealed its patterns only to those willing to examine each thread. The purple ribbon still circled the trunk with its unnaturally perfect bow, but closer inspection revealed something more telling than mere tidiness. The silk showed faint impressions where fingers had worked the fabric, not the casual handling of festival decoration, but the deliberate manipulation of someone accustomed to precise work. More intriguingly, a sticky residue clung to the ribbon's underside, the sort left by hands that had recently handled something waxy or medicinal. Kneeling carefully beside the tree, Miss Marple examined the blue wool thread she had discovered the previous day. Under better light, she could see it was exceptionally fine, the quality used for delicate lacework or intricate embroidery. The break was clean, suggesting it had caught on the bark's rough surface during purposeful movement rather than casual contact. Someone had been working here with concentrated attention, close enough to snag their clothing while reaching upward. The disturbed earth Inspector Craddock had noted proved even more revealing upon careful examination. The compressed soil formed a neat oval, as if someone had knelt here for an extended period. Within this area, Miss Marple discovered a small fragment of waxed paper, the sort used for wrapping homemade confections or, more significantly, medicinal lozenges. "Finding anything of interest?" Inspector Craddock's voice came from behind her. Miss Marple rose with careful dignity, brushing soil from her gloves. "Several small things that may prove large, Inspector. Our murderer is someone with very particular habits, someone who cannot bear to leave anything untidy or imprecise." She showed him the waxed paper fragment and explained her observations about the ribbon's placement. "This suggests our killer prepared poisoned lozenges to substitute for Mr. Pritchard's usual medication. The process required privacy, skill, and intimate knowledge of his habits. Dr. Hammond's toxicology report confirms your theory," Craddock replied grimly. "The poison was aconitine, extracted from monkshood, deadly in small quantities, but requiring considerable botanical knowledge to prepare safely." As they spoke, Eleanor Hartwell approached through the orchard gate, her morning marketing basket clutched tightly. Her greeting was warm but strained, and Miss Marple noticed how her eyes avoided the apple tree entirely. "Terrible business, this investigation," Eleanor said, adjusting her shawl nervously. "I do hope it concludes soon. The uncertainty is dreadful for everyone." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently. "I was just admiring the careful work someone did decorating this tree. Such precise attention to detail. The ribbon is tied with remarkable skill." Eleanor's hands tightened on her basket handle. Mrs. Ashworth organised all the decorations. She's very particular about such things. Of course, though I suspect several ladies contributed their skills. The needlework evident here suggests someone with considerable domestic expertise. A flush crept up Eleanor's neck, but before she could respond, Mrs. Ashworth herself appeared, moving with her characteristic air of organised efficiency. "Miss Marple, Inspector," she said briskly, "I trust you're making progress." The village needs resolution to this unfortunate matter. Miss Marple studied the older woman's appearance with seemingly casual interest. Mrs. Ashworth wore a beautifully knitted blue cardigan, the exact shade of the thread caught on the apple tree. Her hands, though well maintained, showed the slight stiffness that came from years of precise handwork. "Your cardigan is lovely," Miss Marple observed. "Such fine wool. You must have excellent suppliers." Mrs. Ashworth's smile was perfectly controlled. "I order from London. Quality materials are essential for proper work. I find precision in small things helps maintain order in larger matters." After the women departed, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock walked slowly around the tree's perimeter. "3 women," Miss Marple murmured, "each with the skills necessary for this crime. Eleanor Hartwell with her needlework and herb garden, Mrs. Ashworth with her obsession for order and access to festival arrangements, and we mustn't forget Ruth Pritchard, who had the most intimate knowledge of her husband's habits." "Multiple suspects with similar capabilities," Craddock agreed. "How do we narrow the field?" "By understanding that this murder required more than opportunity and skill," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "It demanded someone willing to take enormous risks while maintaining perfect composure, someone who could prepare poison, substitute lozenges, and arrange the scene, all while surrounded by festival crowds." She paused beside a wasp trap hanging from a low branch, noting how it had been repositioned with mathematical precision. "Our killer is someone who cannot resist making small improvements, even when discretion would be wiser. They've left their signature in these tiny adjustments, the relocated trap, the perfect ribbon, the careful positioning of evidence." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the orchard, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. The physical evidence painted a clear picture of methodical preparation and obsessive attention to detail. Yet the psychological profile remained frustratingly broad. Several village women possessed the necessary skills and temperament. The blue thread represented more than mere evidence. It was a character signature. Somewhere in Little Wickham lived someone whose need for precision had ultimately betrayed them. The challenge now was determining which of her suspects had been unable to resist the fatal urge to make everything perfectly murderously neat. The hidden clue was not just what had been left behind, but what it revealed about the mind that had left it, a mind that valued order above human life. The discovery of aconitine poisoning cast a shadow over Little Wickham that no amount of autumn sunshine could dispel. Inspector Craddock's announcement transformed whispered speculation into urgent necessity. Someone among them was a murderer, and the comfortable fiction of natural causes had crumbled like leaves beneath winter frost. The investigation's next phase led inevitably to Wickham Manor, where Harold Pritchard's private papers awaited examination. Ruth Pritchard, summoned from London, proved to be a pale, nervous woman whose grief seemed tempered by something approaching relief. Miss Marple observed her carefully as Inspector Craddock conducted his methodical search of the deceased's study. The locked desk drawer yielded treasures more valuable than gold to a blackmailer. A leather-bound ledger, maintained with obsessive precision, contained entries that reduced human lives to initials and quarterly payments. LB £50 per quarter, GL £75 monthly, DW £100 quarterly, each entry accompanied by cryptic notes that spoke of leverage maintained and pressure applied. Beneath the ledger lay a bundle of letters tied with string, not the purple ribbon that had decorated the apple tree, Miss Marple noted, but practical twine that suggested business rather than ceremony. Inspector Craddock untied them with gloved hands, revealing correspondence that painted Harold Pritchard not merely as an unpleasant neighbour, but as a systematic destroyer of lives. "He called it maintaining community standards," Ruth admitted, when confronted with the evidence, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold believed people needed guidance, correction, He saw weakness and felt obligated to address it. The first confrontation came that afternoon when Lydia Brown was summoned to the village hall. The former schoolteacher arrived with the rigid composure of someone expecting judgment, her hands clutched around a worn leather handbag. "He discovered irregularities in my teaching credentials," she confessed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "A minor discrepancy from years ago, easily explained but potentially damaging if presented maliciously. Harold offered to keep the matter private in exchange for regular contributions to his discretionary fund." Miss Marple studied Lydia's hands as she spoke, neat, precise, accustomed to delicate work. The blue wool of her cardigan matched perfectly the thread found on the apple tree, and her confession revealed the methodical mind capable of planning the perfect murder. George Larkin's revelation proved even more devastating. The farmer arrived at the hall with shoulders bowed by months of financial pressure, his wife hovering anxiously beside him. "He bought up my mortgage when the bank wouldn't extend terms," George explained, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "Then he used it like a whip, demanding payments I couldn't make, threatening foreclosure while offering to restructure the debt for additional considerations." The pattern became clear as more villagers were questioned. Dr. Whitmore admitted to being blackmailed over a disputed medical decision from her London practice. Timothy Graves revealed threats concerning misattributed church donations. Even Mrs. Ashworth, when pressed, acknowledged Harold's knowledge of certain committee irregularities that could have damaged her reputation. Each revelation strengthened the web of motives while demonstrating the psychological precision of Pritchard's methods. He had not simply threatened, he had created ongoing relationships of control, turning his victims into unwilling accomplices in their own subjugation. "The remarkable thing," Miss Marple observed quietly to Inspector Craddock during a brief recess, "is how he maintained such detailed records, each payment dated, each pressure point documented. It suggests someone who found genuine pleasure in the exercise of control, and someone who created numerous enemies with both motive and opportunity," Craddock replied grimly. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, the full scope of Harold Pritchard's impact became clear. He had not merely been an unpleasant newcomer, he had been a cancer eating away at the community's foundations, using private knowledge as surgical instruments to dissect and control his neighbours' lives. Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations while observing the apple tree where it all began. The purple ribbon still circled the trunk with its unnaturally perfect bow, a testament to someone's compulsive need for order. Among all the suspects with their various motives and capabilities, the killer remained hidden, someone whose psychological profile combined murderous intent with the precision necessary to execute such a carefully planned crime. The buried grudges were now fully exposed, creating a landscape rich with potential killers. Yet Miss Marple understood that motive alone was insufficient. The true murderer was someone who possessed not only the desire for revenge, but the particular combination of botanical knowledge, access to the victim, and obsessive attention to detail that had made the perfect crime possible. The question was no longer who wanted Harold Pritchard dead, but who, among his many enemies, had possessed the deadly combination of opportunity, capability, and the fatal flaw of perfectionism that would ultimately betray them. The acrid smell of smoke reached Miss Marple's cottage just after midnight, carried on autumn winds that had turned sharp with the promise of winter. She rose from her bed, with the practiced alertness of someone who had learned to recognize when ordinary disturbances masked extraordinary events. Through her window, orange flames danced against the darkness where Wickham Manor's east wing stood silhouetted against the night sky. The volunteer fire brigade arrived to find Harold Pritchard's study fully engulfed, flames consuming the very room where Inspector Craddock had discovered the blackmail ledger just hours earlier. Miss Marple watched from the garden gate as fire devoured what remained of Pritchard's carefully maintained records of human weakness, the timing too convenient to be coincidental. Ruth Pritchard stood in her nightgown and overcoat, observing the destruction with a composure that struck Miss Marple as unnaturally controlled. Her grief seemed performative rather than genuine, and despite the emergency circumstances, her hair remained neatly braided, her robe belted with precise attention to appearance. "Everything," Ruth whispered to Inspector Craddock, who had arrived within minutes of the alarm. "All his files, his correspondence, his business records. gone. The fire chief examined the scene with professional skepticism. "Started inside the room, sir." Window was opened from within, creating perfect draft conditions. Accelerant was used, something sophisticated, possibly alcohol-based. Burns clean, leaves minimal residue. Miss Marple approached the smouldering ruins with careful steps, her experienced eye cataloguing details others might dismiss. The study window showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting the arsonist had possessed keys or inside knowledge. More tellingly, the fire had consumed paper and wood with remarkable selectivity, leaving metal filing cabinets scorched but intact. As dawn broke over the still smoking ruins, new evidence emerged that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Footprints in the soft earth beneath the study window were pressed deep by someone carrying additional weight. Among the ashes, Miss Marple discovered 2 blue wool fibres caught on the window frame, the same fine quality she had found on the apple tree, positioned too precisely to be accidental. Most intriguingly, a neat row of spent matches lay aligned on the desk's surviving corner, their burnt tips arranged with the compulsive precision she had come to associate with the killer's psychological signature. Even in the act of arson, the murderer could not resist imposing order on chaos. By morning, the village buzzed with fresh theories and misdirected suspicions. Mrs. Ashworth arrived early, ostensibly to comfort Ruth Pritchard, but clearly eager to assess what evidence had been destroyed. Despite the early hour and emergency circumstances, she appeared impeccably dressed, though her shoes showed traces of ash that contradicted her claims of arriving after the fire was contained. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Dr. Whitmore's surgery was discovered broken into, the herbarium shelf disturbed with the same obsessive tidiness that marked the killer's other activities. A single jar was missing, aconitum specimens used for teaching purposes. More provocatively, a small lavender sachet lay crushed on the floor, positioned with deliberate precision rather than dropped accidentally. 2 crimes in quick succession, Inspector Craddock observed as they examined the surgery. A fire that destroys specific evidence, and a theft that points toward the doctor. Either a murderer growing careless, or someone very determined to direct us where they want us to look. The effect on Little Wickham was immediate and divisive. Suspicions swirled around familiar targets. Tom Davy, whose alibi for the fire seemed conveniently solid. Eleanor Hartwell, whose herb garden contained the source of the poison. Dr. Whitmore, whose medical knowledge encompassed both toxicology and accelerant properties. Yet Miss Marple recognized the pattern emerging beneath the surface chaos. The fire represented escalation rather than panic, a calculated attempt to eliminate evidence while simultaneously planting new suspicions. The herbarium break-in was particularly telling, too theatrical, too obviously designed to implicate the doctor while demonstrating the killer's continued access to restricted materials. "The murderer is not losing control," she observed quietly to Inspector Craddock as they walked the manor's perimeter. "They are adapting their strategy." The original crime required patience and subtlety. This destruction appears crude by comparison, but it serves multiple purposes: eliminating evidence, creating new suspects, and reinforcing the narrative of an obvious culprit. The psychological profile was becoming clearer with each desperate maneuver. Someone among the village's respectable citizens possessed both the methodical mind capable of planning perfect murder and the compulsive need for order that betrayed them through small, telling details. The blue wool fibres, the aligned matches, the precisely positioned evidence, all spoke of someone who could not commit chaos without immediately attempting to organize it. Most significantly, the killer's growing boldness suggested mounting pressure. The fire had brought temporary reprieve by destroying Pritchard's records, but it had also revealed the murderer's increasing instability. Fear was entering the pattern, making previously careful stitches uneven and detectable. As the village processed this latest shock, Miss Marple reflected on the escalating desperation she had witnessed. The killer had made their first serious mistake, revealing not just criminal intent but psychological compulsion. The need to tidy even while destroying, to organize even while misdirecting, would ultimately provide the key to unraveling both crimes. Someone in Little Wickham was beginning to crack under the strain of maintaining their perfect facade, and their next move would expose the careful mind behind both Harold Pritchard's murder and the calculated chaos that followed. The morning after the fire brought Inspector Craddock to Little Wickham with renewed purpose, his methodical nature now focused on correlating evidence from both crime scenes. Miss Marple accompanied him through the village, her knitting bag providing perfect camouflage for observation, while her experienced eye catalogued the small inconsistencies that separated truth from carefully constructed alibis. At the post office, Mrs. Graves produced her delivery ledger with characteristic efficiency. "Here you are, Inspector." One parcel from Blakely and Sons, Herbal Apothecary, London, delivered Thursday to Wickham Manor, Harold Pritchard's signature. Another Friday, same sender, signed by Ruth Pritchard. She paused meaningfully. And one from a Bath chemist the week prior, addressed to Mrs. Penelope Ashworth. "Lavender pastilles for committee events," she explained. Miss Marple studied the neat entries while noting Mrs. Graves's careful penmanship. "Mrs. Ashworth believes in proper preparation for public gatherings," she observed mildly. "There's always need for throat lozenges during lengthy speeches." The systematic examination of alibis revealed telling inconsistencies. Eleanor Hartwell claimed awakening to fire sirens, yet her detailed description of flame colours suggested earlier observation. Her mention of checking the herb garden around 11 placed her outdoors during crucial time frames, though her weathered hands and practical demeanour seemed inconsistent with the precision required for the crimes. Dr. Whitmore's account of discovering the herbarium break-in felt rehearsed, with details too perfectly arranged for natural recollection. Her professional knowledge of aconitine was undeniable, yet her genuine anger about the theft and solid alibi for the fire, confirmed emergency call to a sick child, complicated suspicions. Mrs. Ashworth's alibi proved most elaborate. Detailed evening correspondence, reading until 10:30 precisely, household checks before retiring at 11 exactly. The comprehensive nature suggested careful preparation rather than natural memory. At the parish hall, the weekly sewing circle provided Miss Marple with invaluable observation opportunities. Mrs. Ashworth moved among the tables with unconscious efficiency, straightening measuring tapes, aligning scissors, positioning baskets with mathematical precision. When Miss Marple struggled with ribbon tying, Mrs. Ashworth immediately assisted, creating a perfect bow with symmetrical loops and precisely trimmed ends. "Beautifully done," Miss Marple murmured, watching Mrs. Ashworth unconsciously rotate the ribbon until it sat square to the table's edge. "Such even work. I was never skilled beyond simple reef knots." "Precision prevents problems," Mrs. Ashworth replied automatically, then seemed to realize the implications of her words. During afternoon interviews, Inspector Craddock applied subtle psychological pressure. He mentioned the blue wool fibres found at both scenes, watching for revealing reactions. When he described the killer's compulsive need for order, Mrs. Ashworth's composure remained perfect, until he mentioned the aligned matches found in the study ruins, a detail that caused her to unconsciously straighten papers on her lap. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Young David Hartwell approached Miss Marple while she tended Clarissa's garden, his voice barely audible above the autumn breeze. "Miss Marple, I saw something the night of the fire. I couldn't sleep, thinking about Mr. Pritchard. Someone was near the manor before the flames really took hold, coming from the study window direction." He paused nervously. "It was Mrs. Ashworth. She wore a dark coat, but I recognized her walk. She carried a small bag and stopped to tie her shoelace by the garden gate, very carefully." Miss Marple's mind immediately connected this to the compulsive tidiness she had observed. The need for neatness, even during criminal activity, revealed psychological compulsion rather than mere preference. When confronted with David's testimony, Mrs. Ashworth's perfect composure finally showed cracks. Her husband Henry, previously unwavering in support, began faltering under pressure. "Perhaps you went out briefly to check something," he ventured, nervous tremor betraying his uncertainty. Mrs. Ashworth's glare contained raw anger. "Don't be absurd, Henry." "I was in bed." The boy is confused. But Inspector Craddock had saved his most damaging evidence for last. From his jacket pocket, he produced a small silver thimble, distinctive with its delicate engraving. "This was found buried near the study window, beneath where the blue fibres were recovered. I believe it belongs to you, Mrs. Ashworth." The thimble represented the fatal mistake, a personal item that could only have been lost during intense activity. Mrs. Ashworth's face, usually a mask of control, tightened almost imperceptibly. Her meticulously constructed alibi now contained a tiny but insurmountable flaw. Miss Marple observed the psychological dynamics with professional interest. The killer's profile was crystallizing, someone whose compulsive need for order extended beyond normal tidiness into pathological territory. They could not commit chaos without organizing it, could not leave evidence without arranging it according to internal patterns. As evening shadows lengthened across Little Wickham, the investigation had effectively narrowed to its inevitable conclusion. The net had tightened not just around a suspect, but around a psychological profile that matched the evidence patterns precisely. Mrs. Ashworth's very attempts at concealment had revealed her through the compulsive behaviours she could not suppress. The killer had woven an intricate web of deception, but like all such constructions it contained the seeds of its own unraveling. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation. Miss Marple arranged her little trap with the same meticulous care she applied to her most complex knitting patterns, each element positioned deliberately, every detail serving a purpose that would only become clear in retrospect. Clarissa's cottage parlour had been transformed into a stage set for psychological revelation, though the changes appeared merely the result of a busy morning's preparations. The tea service sat slightly askew on its tray, cups not quite aligned with saucers. A small vase of autumn flowers tilted at an uncomfortable angle on the mantelpiece, while scattered matches lay in random disarray near the fireplace, the sort of minor untidiness that would irritate anyone with particular standards. Most, tellingly, a length of purple ribbon, ostensibly saved from festival decorations, drooped from the windowsill in an imperfect bow with uneven ends. At precisely 4 o'clock, the invited guests began arriving for what Miss Marple had described as a quiet discussion about memorial arrangements. Mrs. Ashworth entered first, her appearance immaculate despite recent strains, her handbag positioned at exact right angles to her chair. Eleanor Hartwell followed, nervous energy evident in her constant adjustment of her shawl, while Dr. Whitmore arrived with professional composure intact but watchful eyes that assessed each person present. Miss Marple served tea with gentle efficiency, noting how Mrs. Ashworth unconsciously straightened her saucer and aligned her spoon with mathematical precision. The conversation began with pleasantries about autumn weather, before Miss Marple introduced her carefully chosen topic. "I've been reflecting on the curious nature of accidents," she began, her knitting needles clicking softly. "How they often reveal character more clearly than deliberate actions. Poor Mr. Pritchard's collapse, for instance. Such unfortunate circumstances, yet somehow everything afterwards seemed so organized." Mrs. Ashworth's teacup remained perfectly steady. Natural causes, surely. The stress of his various difficulties must have been overwhelming. Indeed, though I find it remarkable how efficiently the aftermath was managed, Miss Marple continued innocently. Someone ensured proper arrangements despite the tragedy. Such attention to detail during crisis reveals admirable character. As she spoke, Miss Marple deliberately knocked her knitting pattern askew on the side table. Mrs. Ashworth's eyes flickered toward it, her fingers twitching almost imperceptibly before she caught herself. "I sometimes wonder," Miss Marple mused, "if attention to detail can become overwhelming. I knew a woman in St. Mary Mead who couldn't leave anything unfinished or improperly arranged. Even during emergencies, she would pause to straighten pictures or align objects. Quite compulsive, really." Dr. Whitmore leaned forward with professional interest. "Obsessive behaviours often intensify under stress. The need for control becomes paramount when external circumstances feel chaotic." "How fascinating," Miss Marple replied, dropping a stitch and immediately correcting it. "I noticed such precision in Mr. Pritchard's case, the purple ribbon tied with perfect symmetry, evidence arranged so methodically. Even after the fire, Inspector Craddock mentioned finding matches lined up with mathematical precision on the surviving desk corner." Mrs. Ashworth's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her teacup. "Matches? I wasn't aware they were significant." "Oh, they weren't mentioned publicly," Miss Marple said with apparent innocence. "Such an odd detail, arranging matches during a fire, though I suppose some people cannot help organizing their environment, even unconsciously. As if summoned by her words, Mrs. Ashworth unconsciously adjusted the sugar bowl, rotating it until its handle aligned perfectly with the milk jug. The gesture was subtle but revealing, an involuntary response to psychological pressure. Miss Marple rose to tend the fire, deliberately scattering the hearth matches further. "Clumsy of me," she murmured, leaving them in obvious disarray. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Mrs. Ashworth, unable to bear the disorder, bent to align each match in neat parallel lines. Only when she straightened did she realize what she had done, her face flushing with the recognition of her compulsion revealed. "The most telling evidence," Miss Marple continued gently, "was that lovely silver thimble found near the Manor. Such a personal item, lost during intense activity, engraved with initials, I believe, P.A., and quite distinctive scrollwork. The sort of anniversary gift one treasures." Mrs. Ashworth's breathing became slightly more rapid, though her posture remained rigid. Her left hand moved instinctively toward her sewing basket, before stopping abruptly. "I imagine many women own similar thimbles," she said, with forced lightness. "Of course, though this one was quite unique. The owner must feel quite lost without it, like missing a wedding ring or favourite spectacles." Miss Marple's voice remained conversational, but her eyes held steady compassion. "Inspector Craddock mentioned it was found with blue wool fibres, the same fine quality discovered on the apple tree. Such distinctive thread, the sort used for delicate lacework. The trap had been set with surgical precision, each element designed to trigger Mrs. Ashworth's compulsive need for order, while simultaneously presenting evidence of her guilt. The psychological pressure built through seemingly innocent observations, forcing revelation through the very traits that had made the perfect crime possible. Mrs. Ashworth sat frozen, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the gentle but relentless pressure. The scattered matches lay in their neat row, testament to compulsions she could not suppress, even when they betrayed her. From the kitchen came the sound of Inspector Craddock's measured footsteps. He had been waiting, as arranged, for this moment of psychological breakthrough. The gentle trap had been sprung, revealing the killer through her own inability to resist imposing order on chaos, even when that order spelled her doom. Inspector Craddock's footsteps in the hallway provided the final note in Miss Marple's carefully orchestrated symphony of revelation. As he entered the cottage parlour, his presence transformed the cosy tea gathering into something far more serious, though his manner remained respectfully quiet. Mrs. Ashworth sat frozen in her chair, her hand still extended toward the perfectly aligned matches, caught in the act that had betrayed her compulsive nature. "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that Mrs. Ashworth has something she wishes to tell us." The older woman's composure, maintained through months of careful deception, finally began to crack. Her breathing grew shallow, and for the first time since Miss Marple had known her, Penelope Ashworth appeared genuinely vulnerable. Yet even in this moment of exposure, she straightened her shoulders with characteristic dignity. "You cannot possibly understand," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "what Harold Pritchard was doing to this community. He was methodically destroying lives one by one for his own twisted satisfaction." Inspector Craddock settled into a chair, his notebook ready but unobtrusive. "Perhaps you could explain what happened, Mrs. Ashworth." "From the beginning?" Mrs. Ashworth's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup, setting it down with unconscious precision despite her emotional turmoil. "Harold discovered irregularities in the parish fund accounts, minor discrepancies from years ago when my late husband managed the finances during his final illness. Nothing criminal, merely poor bookkeeping, but Harold saw opportunity." "He was blackmailing you," Eleanor Hartwell said with dawning understanding. £50 quarterly, Mrs. Ashworth confirmed bitterly. "Not merely the money, though we could ill afford it, but the constant humiliation. He would arrive for payments with such obvious pleasure in my degradation. He owned me, and he wanted me to know it." Miss Marple nodded with compassionate understanding. "But there was more than financial pressure, wasn't there? Something from your past that made his threats particularly devastating." Mrs. Ashworth's face flushed with shame and anger. "A youthful indiscretion from my service days in London. A scandal that would have destroyed my reputation here completely. Harold found references to it among his correspondence and realized he could use it to maintain permanent control. "So, you decided to act," Inspector Craddock observed quietly. "I studied the problem as I would any household challenge," Mrs. Ashworth replied, her voice growing stronger with confession. Harold's habits were predictable to obsession. He always carried lavender pastilles in his left waistcoat pocket, always took one before public speaking. I researched botanical poisons thoroughly. Aconitine from monkshood was ideal. Concentrated, effective in small doses, easily disguised by lavender's sweetness. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward with professional interest. The preparation would require considerable knowledge. "I approached it like preserving fruit or preparing medicines," Mrs. Ashworth explained with grim pride. "Precise measurements, careful extraction, methodical testing on garden pests first. I prepared the poisoned lozenges over several evenings, working with the same attention to detail I apply to all domestic tasks." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle clicking. "The morning of the festival you substituted your prepared lozenges for his usual ones. During the property dispute in the orchard, while everyone focused on the argument between Harold and James Hartwell, I approached Harold's jacket hanging on the gatepost. A moment's work to exchange the contents of his lozenge tin." Mrs. Ashworth's voice held no remorse, only satisfaction. "I knew he would take one before the prize ceremony. His vanity demanded perfect presentation." "And the purple ribbon?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "I volunteered to adjust the tree decorations specifically to observe his routine and ensure proper positioning. The ribbon needed to be perfect. I cannot bear untidy work, even for such purposes." Mrs. Ashworth's compulsion was evident even in her confession. Inspector Craddock looked up from his notes. "What about the fire at Wickham Manor?" Mrs. Ashworth's composure wavered slightly. Harold's ledger contained detailed records of every payment, every threat, every life he had damaged. I realized it would expose all his victims, creating a parade of suspects. The fire was necessary protection for innocent people. "But you made crucial mistakes," Miss Marple observed. "The blue wool fibres from your cardigan caught on the apple tree bark and later the window frame. The silver thimble lost during the arson. Most tellingly, your compulsive need for order, arranging evidence, aligning objects, creating perfect bows even while committing crimes." Mrs. Ashworth smiled, with bitter irony. "My greatest strength became my fatal weakness. I cannot bear disorder, Miss Marple. Even while destroying evidence, I found myself organizing the scene, arranging details according to my internal sense of propriety. Those matches in Harold's study, they were scattered so carelessly, I had to align them properly." Eleanor Hartwell spoke softly. "You risked everything to protect the village." "Harold Pritchard was a cancer consuming our community," Mrs. Ashworth replied firmly. "I simply excised the malignancy with the precision it required." Inspector Craddock rose with professional gravity. "Penelope Ashworth, I am arresting you for the murder of Harold Pritchard and the arson of Wickham Manor." As the handcuffs clicked softly into place, Mrs. Ashworth turned to Miss Marple with strange serenity. "You understood what others missed, that perfection can become its own prison. My need for order ultimately betrayed me." Miss Marple smiled with gentle sadness. "In my experience, Mrs. Ashworth, the most dangerous criminals are often the most admirable people driven to desperate measures. Your community will remember your years of service." The autumn afternoon had grown long as truth finally emerged in the cottage parlour, revealing not a monster but a woman whose love for order and community had transformed into deadly protection against chaos. The police car departed Little Wickham with quiet dignity, carrying Penelope Ashworth toward a future that seemed impossible just days before. Miss Marple watched from Clarissa's garden gate as the vehicle disappeared around the bend, taking with it not merely a confessed murderer, but the woman who had organized village life with devoted efficiency for over 2 decades. The aftermath settled over the community like autumn mist, present everywhere, yet somehow difficult to grasp. In the tea shop, conversations carried a subdued quality that replaced earlier speculation. The comfortable certainty of social hierarchy had been shattered, leaving residents to navigate unfamiliar emotional territory. "She kept our accounts perfectly for 15 years, Mrs. Fielding confided to Miss Marple over afternoon tea. Never a penny out of place. How does someone like that become capable of murder? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied gently, because someone like that understands better than most what happens when order breaks down completely. Mrs. Ashworth saw Harold Pritchard as chaos incarnate, threatening everything she had spent her life organising. The village's initial shock gradually transformed into something more complex. As details of Pritchard's systematic blackmail emerged, anger that had been suppressed found its voice. He was destroying lives, James Hartwell admitted to Miss Marple as they stood near the apple tree. I should feel vindicated, but Mrs. Ashworth, she was the heart of this community. Communities are more resilient than we imagine, Miss Marple observed. They adapt to loss, even when that loss involves someone essential to their functioning. The practical consequences created immediate challenges. Committee meetings required new leadership, parish accounts needed different management, and dozens of organisational tasks suddenly lacked their customary overseer. Yet gradually other residents stepped forward. Dr. Whitmore accepted temporary responsibility for parish finances, approaching the task with medical precision. Eleanor Hartwell volunteered to coordinate social events, bringing a gentler touch to community organisation. Ruth Pritchard departed for London after settling her husband's affairs, her manner suggesting profound relief rather than grief. He liked to keep people for their usefulness, she told Miss Marple quietly. But he did not keep even himself. The manor would eventually house a young family seeking rural peace, its dark history gradually fading into local legend. Young David Hartwell received praise from Inspector Craddock for his crucial testimony, the boy's courage in speaking truth earning him new respect among villagers. His parents watched him walk taller past the manor gates, as if something within had straightened permanently. The apple tree, once decorated with Mrs. Ashworth's perfect purple ribbon, now stood bare in the autumn air. Children played beneath its branches again, though their parents watched with heightened awareness. That comes after innocence has been altered. The disturbed earth had settled naturally, and groundskeepers had removed the ribbon, finding its symmetry somehow disturbing in light of recent revelations. Inspector Craddock informed Miss Marple that legal proceedings would likely result in manslaughter rather than murder charges. Mrs. Ashworth's counsel argues extreme provocation and community benefit, he explained. The jury may prove sympathetic to her circumstances. Justice takes many forms, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Mrs. Ashworth protected her community the only way she knew how. Whether the law agrees with her methods is separate from whether her motives were comprehensible. On her final morning, Miss Marple walked through Little Wickham one last time, cataloguing subtle changes that marked community adjustment to trauma. The post office operated with slightly less military precision, but warmer human connection. The orchard showed signs of careful tending as James Hartwell reclaimed disputed territory without further legal challenges. At the churchyard, she discovered autumn flowers placed on Harold Pritchard's grave, not Mrs. Ashworth's usual elaborate arrangement, but a simple gathering suggesting someone had found space for forgiveness amid complexity. As the train approached, Miss Marple reflected on the week's events with philosophical acceptance born from decades observing human nature's complexities. Little Wickham had revealed itself as neither peaceful paradise nor corruption hotbed, but something more interesting, a genuine community capable of both profound loyalty and desperate action when threatened. The village would survive Mrs. Ashworth's absence, just as it had survived Pritchard's presence. People would adapt, responsibilities would shift, and life would continue with resilience that had sustained English villages through centuries of change. But Miss Marple knew Little Wickham would never again possess the innocent certainty that had characterized it before the Apple Harvest Festival. They had learned that even the most respectable citizens were capable of murder when pushed beyond endurance, and that knowledge would forever colour their understanding of themselves and each other. The train whistle sounded across autumn countryside as Miss Marple settled into her compartment, anticipating St. Mary Mead's quiet routines. Behind her, Little Wickham prepared to face its future without the woman who had organised their past, carrying forward hard-won wisdom that sometimes the greatest acts of love require the most terrible sacrifices.